advancing the power of education around the world. Welcome to the Cyanna Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Extremely excited about our guest today, but before we get into that, here on the Cyanna Podcast, I want to introduce my talented co-host, as always with me.
What's going on, y'all?
Danny Ortiz, the Global Director of Business Development at Cyanna Education Services.
Long title.
And also excited to be joined again by our friend Mark Sullivan, the President at Cyanna Education Services. Sully, how you doing?
Good. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Sully Mark is in the house.
That's right. So we're excited because Sully put this together because a guy that we know from the industry. We're extremely excited for today's special guest, which is from TFC Tuition, Sean Steinmarc. Sean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really excited to have a great discussion with you folks.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sean, thank you so much again. Tell us about TFC Tuition. Tell us the history, the background. What do you guys do there? What's your role? I mean, that's a loaded question, I know, but I want our folks to know you guys and where you guys come from. But I know you guys, in reading the bio about it, it's been around for a while.
For sure. Yeah, I could probably do an entire podcast on the history of TFC itself. So TFC was started back in 1970, over 50 years ago. You know, our focus is primarily assisting schools with the logistics and these days compliance around providing payment plans and alternative financing solutions to their students.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
So, Sean, what does your role entail, and how long have you been working in this industry?
So I've been around TFC for an extremely long time. I've kind of gone in and out a little bit. So about, it's probably about 15 years ago was when I first came on board full time at TFC. Doing a lot of different strategic efforts, business development, implementing new technologies. I came from a corporate background. I was at Citigroup. I was in a management leadership program. At the point I left, I oversaw contact center operations around the country for their insurance side. When I came to TFC, the goal was sort of to bring TFC a little bit forward to the next level. I did take a step back for a few years. I went out into the startup world, which gave me an extraordinary amount of experience from the tech side of things. And a little bit more understanding some lean concepts. Brought that back to TFC after some great successes and also, of course, failures. It goes hand in hand in the startup world. But at that point, Stan was looking to retire and asked me to come back, came back on. And that's about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago now. And so really what I'm doing here at TFC is helping to kind of move us forward to the next level. My counterpart out in our California office, Ben, he comes from Disney. So he has a corporate background with sort of that customer service and operation experience. So with my technology, strategic background and his customer service and operations background, and then all the finance background I had from education and Citigroup, to be honest, we're really happy to be moving TFC forward to hit that next level.
That's great. So, Mark and I have both operated schools that have actually worked as a client of TFC. So we have a good idea of how you guys operate, what are a lot of those benefits. But we're interested because one of the key things that Cyanna doesn't do is financing, right? That's one of the areas that, Cyanna does not touch. So it's great to have a partner like you on board and specifically on this podcast. Sully, I'm going to cue this first question up for you to ask because you work with a lot of schools. You work with a lot of their compliance issues, operations. I think this first question probably comes best from you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We deal with majority of our clients are going through accreditation, reaccreditation, initial licensure, and the questions always come back to how do I get more tuition revenue dollars, right? And not only how do I get it, but how do I get students to pay it? I have a small staff. How do I it's very difficult. And Sean knows some of the struggles of our clients because I've referred, I think, 2 folks to him this week. But what I would ask Sean is a couple things. A lot of our folks struggle with, how do we set up financing? What's the best way? Do I charge interest rates? Things like that. So can you talk about some of the best practices when you work with clients to help them understand the best way to set up financing for their students?
Absolutely. And you make a good point where a lot of schools don't really understand or know the best way to approach financing. And it used to be probably, 10, 15 years ago, it was easy enough to throw up an Excel spreadsheet and do some calculations, and that was that. But with new regulations on the state and federal level, it gets complicated. Also, schools just aren't set up for the right logistics. From a best practices standpoint, most schools that come to us initially ask us if we can give loans to their students. And I never want to address that question immediately, because what we prefer to find out is what really would work best for the school. Most of these schools that are coming to us, and that I'm sure you're interacting with as well, they really, all they know from history is a loan. They know that buy a car, get a loan, buy a house, get a loan. Right. Versus if you really think about it, what is in the best interest of the student and the school? And what we usually recommend for schools at the outset is look at having an internal payment plan. So the idea of extending student payments over time, and I know there's a lot of hesitation there, and we can talk about that in a minute. But really what it comes down to is, if you think about a cell phone analogy, where how many people are willing to drop $1,500 on their cell phone day one? Very few people will pay in full for a cell phone. It's a no-brainer to all of us that instead of spending $1,500 on that cell phone day one, you can pay over time. It's just added to your cell phone bill, and maybe it's a $25, $50 a month payment. And yeah, that really locks you in to that provider, but it allows you to extend the payments over time, and it enables people that can't necessarily afford a $1,500 cell phone to extend it over time and be able to afford that phone. Very similar to education. I may not be able to afford your $10,000 tuition that I have to pay up front. I may not be able to afford a 10-month payment plan at $1,000 a month, but I could absolutely afford a $250 a month payment plan and extend it out over a few years. And really, that's what we encourage schools to do, is to look at what is affordable for their students and bring in that student, because the goal is not money. The goal is successful graduates. And as much as everybody needs to operate a business,
that's good.
Schools need to operate as a business, whether they're nonprofit, for-profit, they need to have revenue coming in so that they can afford to continue their operations. If you can lay that payment out over time, they'll have more revenue coming in over the future. And then there's not as much worry about bringing in more students to successfully graduate. From the interest question that you had, what we typically recommend, many of our schools, I'd say about half of our schools, charge no interest at all. Then some schools will say, well, no interest while they're in school, but if they need to extend past graduation, they'll charge a few points of interest. Every state has their own requirement, and that requirement isn't necessarily just a flat number. It's usually based on a variety of factors. What is being financed? How much is being financed? What is the total amount of payments? What's the term? So what we usually recommend is look at it as staying in line with government rates, or around 3%, 6%, something that isn't really looked at as income. A school should not be looking at his interest as income. They should simply be looking at it as a way to offset the cost of extending payments over time. If they were sticking money in the bank, they'd earn a little bit of interest. So instead, put a payment plan and charge the student that interest.
Interesting. So as you're working with some of these schools and they're approaching TFC with maybe they're a little like naive about the process, what are some of those misconceptions that you've seen in your experience of when a school comes to the table that you have to clear up for them?
There are a lot, and it really depends on the school. And I'm sure, you guys have had this experience at Cyanna. When you're dealing with regulations, things don't always make immediate sense to a school because they're not in the nitty gritty. This is why we love also referring clients over to Cyanna to find out what they need to do from a state regulation perspective, because compliance wise, there's so much intricacy that is hard to understand if you're not living it day in, day out. So finding the right expert is pretty key. Some really simple things that schools don't understand, things that might pop up where, I've had schools that have said to me, well, do we really need to get licensed, or do we need to work with a servicer who's licensed because we're not charging interest to a student? We're not doing anything besides having an internal payment plan. And I've actually had the conversation where I ask them and I say, and I always bring this up to a school, if you're not charging any interest whatsoever to be on a payment plan, what is the incentive for a student to pay in full? If I have the choice between paying in full or extending my payments over time, and there's no difference whatsoever, why would I ever pay in full in the beginning? And I've had the response be, well, we don't charge interest, but we charge a finance fee. We charge an administration fee. And what schools don't realize is that has to be disclosed a specific way. That has to be disclosed as interest. And it is still in the best interest of the school to do those proper disclosures, even for the benefit of the student, the benefit of the school. They just don't realize that they need to do things that way.
Interesting.
Man.
Sully, you help a lot of schools start up like right out of the gate, right? That's what we do too. We help schools get started. That's a very common route of a lot of our new clients, right? And Danny, you've seen that all the time. You have brought a number of these new schools.
And they don't understand. I have so many questions and I'm trying to be nice, Sean, but I'm acting like the school that doesn't know here. I'm really be honest because
don't be nice. Hop in, ask me the tough questions. I don't need to.
I want to know, are you helping in the payment plan, a technology, a software that you're telling that school, hey, this is the software that you need? Is there like the top 5 softwares? Like how did that school that doesn't know anything about payment plan, how do they even start thinking about how do I go through a payment plan situation? Yeah.
So we onboard schools with a pretty rigorous discussion around best practices and how to do everything. We provide the software. Awesome. So TFC has our internal software tool.
That's exactly what I wanted to get to.
Yeah, exactly. So, we have our software. It's a portal. It's all online that schools have access to for free as clients. And that software will do all of the calculations, including interest, which really they should not be doing on their own because they always do it incorrectly. No offense to the schools out there that are doing it on your own and think you're doing it correctly.
Sure. Of course.
So, our software will do all the calculations, and the student, the school can go back and forth with the student, figure out affordability, have multiple tiers. So you can think of it like a layaway program where maybe they're paying $100 a month while they're in school, and it increases to $200 a month after they graduate, or $500 a month after they graduate, or 0% interest in school and 3% after they graduate, situations like that. So the software produces all of those calculations, as well as the retail installment contract, which is the legal financial instrument that the students would need to sign. And we provide the ability to either print that out to sign by hand or do everything electronically, which is obviously the preferred method of doing everything these days, especially over the past few years. The retail installment contract, federal truth in lending disclosures, which again, many schools, in particular new schools, don't realize all of the disclosures that you have to provide, especially as an institute of higher education. If a school is accredited, they absolutely need to provide this. But many schools think that they're not accredited sometimes yet, so they don't need to provide certain disclosures. No, if you're teaching a career, and it's very similar to whether they need to be licensed by the state. If you're educating a student for future success, you really need to give all the right disclosures, and our software will provide all those disclosures and paperwork, et cetera. And that's how they do. And then we walk them through, and you get best practices. How do I figure out what a student can afford? Do I want to run a credit check on a student or not? Do we want to report to credit bureaus? Even little things like handling, there's a waiting period. So a student has 3 business days to withdraw after they sign their paperwork, legally following federal truth in lending guidelines. They legally have the right to withdraw within a few days with absolutely no penalty. So the software handles that as well, making sure that all that compliance is done.
That's so good.
Yeah, that's great. And, we've talked a lot about state regs, right? Every state has different rules and regs that schools have to understand. What about the federal level? And what's your position on the recent loan forgiveness decision by the current administration? Would love to get your feedback on that.
Now you have 2 separate questions popping in, federal regulations and then student loan forgiveness. Why don't we start with the fun conversation of student loan forgiveness?
Yes.
I have, so counter to my own interests, I suppose. I'm a fan of free education. I am a fan of loan forgiveness to a certain extent. And I will probably have many people who disagree with me heavily. And I encourage everyone to reach out to me because I love having this conversation. And I feel free to push back on me here too. So starting with free education, I would say, 50 years ago, free high school education, you go out and get a job. These days, without some sort of a post-secondary degree, it is difficult to earn the same way that you could earn 50 years ago. You graduate high school education, you go get a job, you can afford your house, you can afford to feed your family. Single income family was fine. There's no way that happens today. You need a college education to some extent. I don't think all education should be free. I think that there should be a certain level that maybe is covered by the government or by other support or, cheaper education to a certain extent. Pell Grants are very helpful for things like that if they're applied properly. It needs to be extended across all types of education. I do not like to see the gap between what's provided to, a traditional liberal arts education and a trade, especially when folks going for trades are typically the individuals who need more immediate funds. So they probably need the more immediate help as well. So that is sort of a little bit of a very simple explanation on my side about education. Federal loan forgiveness, my personal opinion is that the bigger impact would have been to forgive interest. I think the interest is really what causes the problem with the ballooning payments that students have. I know so many people in very high-level professional positions that have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, even $50,000 in debt, because they graduate school, they go on the income-based repayment, which is a phenomenal program, and I encourage everybody to look into that if they're not already, for their own personal or their children or anybody in their family. Income-based repayment is great because it allows students to pay or allows graduates to pay what they can afford. The problem is that it rarely covers the interest that is accumulating on the loan. So the debt principal just keeps ballooning. And that is what has created such an issue these days. The pushback most people have against loan forgiveness is that it's not fair that this loan is being forgiven. Somebody took out a loan. And I agree with that. Somebody took out a loan, they should pay it back. But on the flip side, somebody took out a loan at a 7% interest rate as an 18-year-old without really thinking about it. And then 10 years later, they've now ballooned these payments. They ballooned this principal to $100,000 when they only took out $50,000 originally. What's fair about that? So if you start forgiving the interest, it alleviates some of that black cloud that sits on top of everybody. $10,000, I know it's going to help statistically. Supposedly, it's going to help a significant number of people. I think the individuals with significant debt who are most hurt in their life by their debt, the $10,000 won't even be meaningful by the end of it, because if I'm never going to pay back my loan in the first place, chopping $10,000 off the back end, what does that do for me?
Right.
Yeah, I think the interest rate, that's an interesting concept, because I've never heard that.
I haven't heard it either, Sean. I was going to say, I'm going to use that, and I'm going to credit you for that, because that's actually an excellent point in this conversation.
Yeah, it's a great point.
And Sean, to kind of piggyback off of what you said about this state of how many folks have debt in this country, do you think that the current shifts in the economy and the prevalence of debt and oftentimes student loan debt, do you think that is going to create more of an appetite for vocational education over these traditional higher ed avenues? And are you seeing that?
I think there's a combination of factors. I absolutely think vocational is becoming more popular. And in fact, I think it was today or maybe yesterday, the new president or the probable president for University of Florida, which, we're talking traditional liberal arts education, has a stance on education that, vocational education is a little bit underappreciated. You're starting to see a lot more focus on those types of jobs that directly lead to a career versus a liberal arts education that also could lead to a career, but you also see a lot of students graduating liberal arts educations who can't get jobs. I'm an outcome of liberal arts education. Granted, the business school aspect to it, you could consider that to be a trade. It gave me a vocation. But liberal arts education is great for some people. Vocational education is great for some people. And I do see a shift that more people are realizing that they can either spend a couple $100,000 on a liberal arts education over 4 years, or they can go to school for 3 months a year, graduate, and immediately start earning a very good income with some particular trades. The other aspect I see is just the lessening cost of education for non-traditional schools. So I know Cyanna is working with quite a few distance education schools where you can still get that liberal arts degree. You can still get that bachelor's, but you're learning online. You're learning in a non-traditional way that is removing some of that excess cost. I don't think we need to eliminate universities by any means. It's important.
Sure.
You have research schools that the research needs to get done. We need to progress as a society. We need that education. We need that type of school to exist. But for an under-resourced student who can't afford $50,000 a year or semester, and isn't either, maybe they don't qualify for aid, or the worst situation where their FAFSA reflects an estimated financial contribution by their family of a greater amount than their parents are willing to pay. There are a lot of students out there that are in great need and do not qualify for the needs for the education or for the federal support that they need. Vocational trade is great for them, as well as this distance education option to get that liberal arts degree that they want.
Great. One more question specific to the industry as a whole before we kind of pivot to maybe what's ahead and what's in the future here. Talking about different types of aid, different types of schools, different types of outcomes, all of these different things. One thing that touches on all of this is the idea of, or not the idea of, but just regulation, right? There's a ton of regulations. I don't want to lead this question. I just led this question by saying a ton. But, what's your position on how much regulation is currently in this space? Do you think there's enough? Do you think there's not enough? What's your thoughts on that today?
If you were to ask me this question a few years ago, I might have said that when the let's say the student loan servicing licensing regulations were popping up in the States, at that moment, I might have pushed back and said, this is ridiculous. I can't believe they're pushing in to regulate this. I might not have agreed with it. Over time, as we have been licensed by the states, and we've gone through the process, and we've looked and read through the regulations, and then really talked with schools about it, we realized, honestly, the regulation makes sense. In certain cases, they might go a little overboard, but, the example I gave earlier of schools not really understanding the proper way to charge financing fees or interest, these aren't actions that schools are doing to the detriment of students. These are actions that they're doing because they think that it helps the student, but they're not doing it the proper way. And this isn't their daily life, so they don't really understand what helps the student. So having the regulation in place is what actually leads to a better outcome for the student and the betterment of the student. And then the reason that a lot of the states started with this were for actions that some of the federal servicers were doing that actually were to the detriment of students. I'm not going to necessarily call out any particular companies, but I've even spoken to some myself on behalf of friends trying to figure out their own federal loans. And I've called a few years back before the regulations in place. I would call a student loan servicer and for a federal Title IV servicer and ask questions about income-based repayment, because those programs are incredibly complicated. And I called, had an answer, and I felt that it was wrong. Called back, had a different answer, felt it was wrong. Called back, had a third different answer, felt it was wrong. So I went and read the regulations. I literally read the regulations that were passed by the laws passed by Congress and the regulations that were set up around how the income-based repayment worked. And all three responses I got on from the servicer were wrong, and the information that they had on their website was wrong. And that is not to the betterment of the student. Having a consistent approach, having regulation to ensure that things are being done properly And again, to the betterment of the student, really focusing on what will lead to a better outcome for a graduate. That is the way that everybody should approach things. And I really, truly think, I mean, there are always going to be bad players, but the vast majority of schools really want the best outcome for their students. They just don't understand how sometimes. And I'm sure, I mean, I would love to hear Sully's perspective on this too, from both, I know your stance on just regulation in general, but I'm sure you also have some insight into, obviously the not financing, but, is it better for schools to be regulated by states and have to be licensed by states, or should everybody be able to just go out and get an education, anywhere they want?
Running schools, to your point, most people are doing the right thing, right? To say that everybody's evil and everybody's doing the wrong thing is just a way off. And one of my challenges with regulation and rules is that every time something comes out as regulation that has to be disclosed to the student is another page of written word that nobody reads anymore.
Yes.
So you go through and you're signing off on your FAFSA and you're going through 11 pages of words you're never going to read. It's like a user agreement on an app or a website. Like,
it's a manual.
I say yes because I'm not reading 13 pages of dribble.
Yeah.
100%. And I always go back to, I think we can improve not just regulation, but the ability for a student to understand what they're signing without having to read 1,000-page documents.
Yeah, and I feel the same. I mean, when we rolled out, updates. I mean, this is years ago, but with all the updates to truth in lending and all the retail installment contract regulations on a state level. So every state has a different contract. So, and this is another example actually, schools don't really realize is if you have students in various different states, the contract should not be based on the state in which the school exists. It is wherever the student resides. So you literally, a distance education school needs to have 52 contracts, every 50 state, DC and Puerto Rico. And it gets complicated. But when we rolled that all out and we had pushback from many schools, we went from a 1 to 2 page document a student had to sign to your point, multiple pages that is, it's tough to imagine students reading it as much as you encourage them to and force them into initialing and try to make them scroll. Think about, terms of service when you sign up for anything online. Who reads those?
Exactly. And if you want to be a nurse, you're not going to get to the last section and go, you know what? You had me until paragraph 8 on page 15. I'm out.
Done. I'm out. I'm not signing.
And then problem. It is, and then you run into issues with regulatory compliance that are competing. So the state says you have to announce graduation rates of this date, and then your creditor says this date, and they both you actually are being encouraged to publish conflicting information to students.
Yeah, wow. And I would say you are in a worse position dealing with all of those regulations than we are, because we hit the same thing. There are conflicting federal and state regulations when it comes to some of the disclosures and some of the financing regulations. But this goes back to TFC. I mean, this is, should I be stating this on a public forum, but we will always defer to the betterment of the student. So, example might be how late fees are disclosed, or what late fees are. So we always just look at it as, well, we'll go to the root of the regulations and we'll try to work what is better for the student. Because honestly, when it comes down to it, I would find it hard pressed for anybody to argue against a school and get a school put on the hook because they did something that had a better outcome for a student. And that is why we always lean that way. But it causes significant issues, which is also why, as much as I think that there should be less federal regulation, maybe more state regulation, in certain things, I lean towards federal. We have, now I'm losing track, but 11 to 13 states that have student loan servicing regulations that are different. And how do you comply with all of the different states when they have different requirements of what you're supposed to do? And some states now have transcript regulations where you're not allowed to hold back a transcript from a student that owes a debt, which I 100% agree with. I think it's wonderful that is now a law. And we always encourage our students or our schools to provide students with certificates and transcripts and anything they needed upon graduation, even if they had a debt. But doing things at a federal level just gets consistency instead of having to deal with, we're a flat world now. You're not just working in one state, you're working in multiple states, even if your school exists only in one state. So getting a little consistency is a good thing.
Awesome.
Sean, you're giving us so much, man. I feel like I just, listen, look at my notepad, Sean, man. You got me writing over here. I love it.
Like I'm talking too much. I want
to. No, this is great. This is what we need this, man. This is golden. You said earlier when we first started talking that you're excited about bringing TFC Tuition, forward, right? Where is the industry going? Without telling us any future secrets, but giving us something, what are you looking forward to? Where are you looking for the industry going to? Where you guys see yourself going?
Ooh, without giving any secrets. I would love to solve the student loan crisis that exists in the United States.
So good.
We have toyed with different thoughts on ways to address that. There are a lot of new ideas out there that aren't actually new. Income share agreements is one that that's been out since the mid 2000s. It really picked up steam a few years back with Purdue getting into it, but they've actually shut down their program looking for a new servicer. But there's a lot of conversation around whether those programs are fair. There are different ways to address student loans and providing financing to individual students, and that's kind of what we're toying around with. Is what is the best way for kind of triple bottom line idea. We want success for the student, we want success for the school, we want success for society. So how do we help facilitate that as a concept? We have a very I'm not going to necessarily call it unique approach in general, but from the roots of TFC when Stan started it 50 years ago, it was a single school. It was not a big school. They're a big school now, but the concept of what he did, which was new. I mean, Title IV didn't exist back then. There was really no option for students that could not pay in full. They just said, "Oh, I have a debt, and I'll pay it at some point." So he was an origin of this whole world. How can we take that to the next level? And we hold tight to that. We still work with small mom and pop schools. We'll get referrals for brand new schools. They'll want to finance or set up a payment plan for one or two students, and we're not making tons of money off of those schools. That's not what we're in this for. We're in this for figuring out how to improve education and bring all of those students to the next level. That successful graduate, that successful career, the impact to society that can have. So if we can solve this whole problem of affordability and students getting left behind and the education gap, and something we haven't even talked about, which is stranded credits, which is this concept that, a semester-based school, you'll find the vast majority of schools around the country, if a student owes a balance, and sometimes as low as $100, if they owe a balance, they're not allowed to register for the coming semester. And for, if I have outstanding fines, parking bill, whatever it might be, and I owe my school $150 and I'm not allowed to register for the next semester and I can't come back to school, how is that successful for anybody? Trying to address these issues and enable schools to increase the affordability for those students and get more graduates and get more students even in the door in the first place. Let's move forward education. Let's get rid of that education gap by increasing affordability and get rid of some of the financial insecurity and the home insecurity and the food insecurity that is such a problem in our sector, which we could do a whole podcast on.
We're going to have to. We're going to have to have it back for sure, man. This is so good.
Awesome.
Hey, Sean, this has been great. We're really grateful for all this insight. This is just invaluable to folks who, watch and listen to the Cyanna Podcast, because a lot of those folks are school owners, they're school operators. So this is great. So for those folks who want to learn more about TFC Tuition, where can they find you guys at online?
Simple, tfctuition.com. They can email info@tfctuition.com. I'm also happy to, interact with them. They can find me online pretty much anywhere. Just go to our website, shoot us an inquiry, give us a call. We are, again, any size school. We have small mom and pop schools. We have multi-campus systems, multi-state systems. Anybody
so ready for all comers.
All comers. Our goal is one or two students. I don't care how big your school is. If you have one student that needs help, let's get them financed. Let's get that student graduated.
Great. Sean, thank you for the partnership as always. Thank you for the friendship. And I'll turn it over to Scott and Danny to take us home.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. I hope that we can do it again. I like this, maybe start this as a series review, man, because I think it was invaluable information. And I just love your heart in wanting to help. And I think we all share that in common, man. We just want to help every single person that we come in contact with.
Sean, thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.